Welcome back to the channel, guys. I am the Drunken Goth, and today we are diving straight back in with the GT4. So we are very hopeful that now the aircon pump has been degassed, we can get that out of the way. Obviously we will dive into the valve clearances as well, get them all checked, and basically keep stripping things down until we get to a point where we can get around everything, where we can see everything, start cleaning everything back up, get this big service sorted out, and carry on from there. So we are currently rowing back in with the cam belts. As you can see now, we have both the aircon pump off and the big bracket off, but we're not very impressed at the minute with whoever last cam belted it, as this bracket was actually loose and wobbling around, which would explain the rattle I first heard when the car first arrived and we was first firing it up. So it did have a little bit of a rattle from down there. I assumed it was just static from the cam belts, as they can sort of crackle a little bit with the static as it arcs into the metal belt guards. But no, it was in fact that bracket against there was rattling quite a lot, as it hadn't been tightened up at all. Nevertheless, it's not a problem, it's something we can sort. Obviously we will do it properly, and let's row straight back in. So back to that front belt guard. Well, it's quite loose as well. Yeah, whoever's cam belted this in the past has not done a very good job. Of course, no offence to any of the specialists out there that may have worked on this car, but expected a little bit better. So that is one belt guard removed. So we'll get this all cleaned up. And obviously now you can see tensioner bearing, ends of the cams, the belt, all ready for us to begin working on. So now we'll do the other side, get that off, and that should give us full access to both of the cam belts. So, with a bit of fiddling, we then get it. So, both of the belt guards are off. Obviously the rear bank is a little bit trickier because it's very, very tight against this beam just behind the shock. So it is a bit of a wriggle to get it out, but not too bad, quite easily doable. So, we now have a good view all the way around the engine, and we can row in with doing these cam belts. So a quick adjustment of camera angle here so that you can get a good view of the front of the engine without the camera in an awkward position and my large forehead constantly popping up in the picture. So, doing the valve clearances. Basically, one at a time, we've got to make sure that each one of the cam lobes is facing directly upwards, flattest section is against the valve bucket on the back, and then we're going to measure the gap with the feeler gauges and see what kind of gap we've got, and this is how we do the valve clearances. So while I am rowing in with those valve clearances, it is important to mention a good set of feeler gauges is critical. You don't want a cheap set that doesn't have that many options. You want to get the valve clearance measurement as accurate as possible. Obviously, as I said, cam lobe 180 degrees away from the valve bucket, so you get a good accurate reading. The inlet is to be set at 0.008 to 0.010, and the exhaust cam is 0.012 to 0.014 in inches. Obviously, once that's done, once you've got your true readings of what it is now, you can then order the different thickness of the shims for the top of the valve buckets and adjust them to get them within that tolerance. Checking and setting the valve clearances is a scheduled work, and you should be able to find that in your service book how often it should be done. But you will always find as well, once it's been done and it's been done correctly, the car runs a lot better. So this will make a lot of difference to the running of this engine. There we go, that is one bank done. So now we're going to repeat the same process on the rear cylinder head. So next up now at this point, we're going to get the carbs off. Once they're off, we can get them on the bench, we can start cleaning them up, start getting them stripped down. We've got carb rebuild kits on order, so as soon as they're off, we can start stripping them down, get them all cleaned out, replace all the perishables, and get them looking as good as new. So while I am rowing in, taking off those carbs, there is a few things just to mention. Obviously, if you're doing this on a car that's already been restored, if everything's all nice and clean, you want to make sure you've got a little bit of paper towel handy, as when you undo the banjo bolts on the fuel lines, it will weep slightly. So again, if everything's all nice and clean and you want to avoid any fuel spills, just make sure you've got a little bit of paper towel held just underneath those banjo bolts as you slacken them off and take them out. Another thing is, obviously on both sides of the fitting on the banjo you have copper washers. Just make sure that, especially with the way I'm doing it at this point, that you don't lose one of those copper washers, as you can see with me having the cam covers off, you really don't want one of those copper washers to slip out your hands, drop into the cams. So again, just be very careful making sure you've got those copper washers as well. Now obviously when we took the cam cover off that rear cylinder head, we mentioned that we had the throttle cable threaded through the top of it. Now when you're doing the carbs, there's also two more throttle arms, throttle linkages in the centre of the V. These again, same way, split pin held through the end nut. Once that's out of the way, a screwdriver can go in, you can just slacken that off just enough to slip it off the ball joint on the end of the cam and get those out of the way. Once that's done, it's on to taking the nuts off that bolt the carbs down to the inlet manifold. Now a midget spanner is probably preferable at this point, as it can be a little bit tricky to get a full-size spanner in and around the carbs and onto those nuts. And with one of the nuts, it won't actually come all the way off unless you wriggle the carb upwards. So basically you have to take off 3 of the nuts first, then leave one till the last thing, because with the length of the stud on the inlet manifold and a protrusion on the side of the carb, you have to lift the carb halfway up as you're slackening that nut to be able to get it all the way off. Obviously, again, it is always worth mentioning that be very careful when you're taking these nuts off. As you're taking the carbs off, you don't then suddenly want one of the nuts to drop down into the inlet manifold, especially the washers, as they are a very specific washer. They are a dished washer, not a spring washer or anything like that. so they are specific to the setup bolting the carbs down onto the inlet manifold. As I've recommended before, it is definitely worth having an extendable magnet handy, just in case you do drop anything, but also just as an aid to getting those washers and those nuts off. So definitely worth keeping one of those handy. And of course, something else I would definitely recommend is, once you've got these carbs off, again, to prevent anything from going down into the inlet manifold, just get some paper towel, ball it up and stick it into the holes in the inlet manifold, because again, the last thing you want is to go to all of the effort of trying to take all these bits off, get everything nice, and then find that a nut or a washer has dropped into the inlet manifold, dropped down into the cylinder, and of course then it's a very big problem. That the engine will not like that at all. Also, you may have seen there are various bits of wire connecting the carbs together. This is for the choke system. So there is a lever inside the car that you can set the choke for hot or cold. These are taken off. Basically, there's a flat bladed screwdriver, and you can slacken the screw that holds them in place, and then just slide the wire out. Obviously there's a choke cable at the front as well, right next to the throttle cable. That again, slacken it off on the carb and it should just slide out. Now it does seem a little bit pointless, because carbs that are decently set up on a 308, you should never really need to use the choke. So even when starting it from cold, a couple of pumps on the throttle, turn the key, and she should fire up straight away and stay running. So the carbs, you don't really need it, but obviously when you are taking it off, again, easily done, slacken the bolts, slip straight out, and away you go. So as you can see, we are just about finished, just about getting that last carburetor off, and there we go, all the carbs are off, on the bench, ready for restoration. So for the moment we're putting them to one side. Obviously we have got carb rebuild kits on order, so we will put them in a video, specifically stripping them down, rebuilding them, getting them all as good as new. And a quick view of the engine. As you can see, a lot more room, a lot more access to everything with those carburetors out of the way. So now at this point we have our new timing belt bearings, cam oil seals, new cam belt. So we are going to start off by slackening this nut, forcing the tension off the belt. Once we've got the tension off that belt will come off. We're going to take these 3 nuts off here, take the tension out of the way, replace that tensioner, and then we're going to whip the cams out, new cam oil seals on, cams back in, and then we can get the new belt on. cam belt off. And now tension bearing. So in order to change this, I'm going to put a set of grips on here to stop this piece shooting out. I'm going to undo this, new bearing off, old bearing off, new bearing on, and that should be that. So I'm not sure if you can tell, but I did actually struggle quite a lot getting this nut off. So I think it's definitely worth mentioning that if you get something like this where it's a real struggle to get the nut off, make sure you've got a thread chaser handy, and just make sure you clean up those threads while you've got access to them, while everything's all stripped off. Give those threads a good clean up so that you're not struggling putting the nuts back on, not struggling tightening anything up. Everything should be all nice and clean, should be relatively easy. So, nut all polished up on the wire wheel, that back on. Grips off the end, all done, good as new. So that's done. Tensioner bearing back in. With new nuts and new washers. So another thing just to note, obviously at the moment here I am just tightening that tensioner bearing back into its place, but the cam belts can be a little bit tight to slip back on to the tensioner bearing. So what I would recommend, unfortunately I didn't quite catch it on video, is that these 3 M8 nuts that I'm tightening up at the minute, if you slacken them back off, it gives you just enough play in the tensioner bearing so that if the cam belt is a little bit tight being slipped on, you can just, it gives you that little bit more play just to slip the cam belt back on easily. Once it's back in place, you then tighten those 3 M8 nuts back up and it just pulls everything back into place nicely before you let the tension off on that tensioner bearing. So with them new cam oil seals in, belt now on, slack at the bottom, timing marks that we've put on ourselves lining up and on the cams, just about got everything into position. Slacken off the tensioner. That should give us all the tension we need back on that cam belt. And that is one done. So, as we said before, we're not going as far as we would like to on this, but as you can see at this point, there's new tensioner bearings, new nuts and bolts, more or less everything cleaned up apart from the pulleys on the front. The difference is night and day, looking good as new. So that is the cam belts and valve clearances done, along with the tensioner bearings and the cam oil seals. Obviously you didn't see much of me fitting the cam oil seals. It's a bit fiddly getting those cams in and out. Obviously I wanted to focus exactly on getting it all right. But that is the sort of rough process that most dealers and specialists will do when your car goes in for a cam belt service. Now obviously that is it for today's video. We're still a long way off from being finished. We've still got to polish up them belt guards, get them looking stunning, get them refitted before then reattaching the aircon pump, getting the alternator and aircon belts back on the auxiliary belts. But obviously we've got a lot of cleaning up to do as well before we do that. We want everything to look as nice as possible, get everything looking absolutely spot on. So that is it for today's video. If you enjoyed the video, please drop a like on it, please subscribe to the channel, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you all on the next one.